Hi and welcome to this SIAM series where I'm going through the IT management approaches, methodologies, activities and practices. I'll be giving you the main headline points, the base foundation you need to know about. I'll also discuss some of my real world application of these activities and practices in the various organisations I've worked in. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like and click the bell to get those updates. Okay, so let's get to it. Today I'm going to be covering off the key concepts in SIAM, Service Integration and Management, around structure types. I've already done a video around the externally sourced service integrators. This is now going to be talking about internally sourced service integrators. So a quick reminder, there's four common SIAM structures. You've got an externally sourced service integrator, an internally sourced service integrator, a hybrid, which you won't be surprised to know is a combination of the two, and a lead supplier. Now, this video is going to dig more detail into the internally sourced service integrator, but I've already done a video around externally sourced videos, and the hybrid and the lead suppliers will be there shortly as well, so please do check that out. In the context of what does structure mean generally, I'm talking around SIAM structures here. In terms of structures relating to governance, to board, to organisation, to contract, management and licensing structures, all within the SIAM. I'll be doing separate videos about that, but this series is about SIAM structures in terms of what type of service integrator. So if we refresh ourselves, why would an organisation go down the SIAM route anyway? What would be the driver there? What would be the factors? And typically there's a whole bunch of business requirements. Perhaps that's value based, the cost is unclear. Maybe there's a requirement for better governance and oversight or assurance, perhaps quality issues, contractual issues, complexity is quite a common reason I see, but also better integration generally. Also, capabilities take part in that decision-making process, the maturity of the organisation, the maturity of the teams, both technical and non-technical, departments, processes, practices, resource availability plays a part in the equation, as does skill sets. Typically, the size of organisation is going to be a factor in there, the size of the organisation, and also whether there's any regulatory requirements needed and what those are in terms of to what level of compliance is needed there or legislative requirement. So budget, as always, takes an important part in that as well. Timescales is another element. There are kind of pros and cons depending on which model you choose as to the timescales, but also the volume and the type of service providers that are in the ecosystem. Another consideration is the appetite of things like loss of control or maybe there's greater risk in some areas. So there's a definite sort of appetite question that needs to be asked around what's the view of loss of direct control? Yes, no? What about risk? What's the appetite there? So if we now focus on internal service integrators. So this is the structure. If you remember, you have three layers to this. You have an organizational capability layer, and then you have a service integrator layer, and then you have your service provider layers, and the customer organization would typically have the retained capabilities in there, things like architectural practices, enterprise architecture, any kind of strategic activities, risk, contract management, governance and oversight, business engagement, those kind of activities. And that would typically be in the customer organization layer. However, in the internal service integrator model, there's another element that fits in the customer organization, and that's internal service integrator. So if you picture it, you've got, rather than the three layers, customer, service integrator, service provider, you've actually got two layers. You've got customer and then you've got service provider, and the customer layer has two elements to it. It has its retained capabilities, as it always has, but now there's another element in there, which is the customer is now becoming the internal service integrator. So the customer is taking the role on of that SI, that service integrator, and they themselves are providing service integration capabilities. The service integrator role still needs to be defined, and it still needs to be managed separately, but the way to kind of picture it is you've got your customer organization with retained capabilities, and then a separate function, which is the service integration activities, the service provider orchestration, the integration pieces, the collaboration element. So why and when, what circumstances would a customer use this kind of structure? So in the external model, we said, well, you would choose an external model if you didn't have capabilities, if you didn't have the resources or the integration already within your internal organization. So in an internal structure, it's the opposite. The internal structure would say, actually, we already have internal in-house service integration capabilities. And not only that, we may want to continue to maintain them and grow them. So it's almost the opposite of the internal approach, which is an internal approach will say, yes, we've already got the resources and we want to grow it. The external approach is the opposite to that, which would say, no, we don't have the capabilities and neither do we want to grow them or maintain them. Another reason an organization would take up the internal service integrator approach would be around retaining control and retaining flexibility over the ecosystem overall. So the SIAM ecosystem is effectively two layers. It's the customer and the service provider. Of course, the customer layer is split in half in terms of service integrator and retained capabilities. But if time scales allow, that can be something that that can be a real benefit if there's a timing element to it, that this has to be done quickly. Using an internal model can be spun up relatively quickly. Remember, I spoke of an example previously where time was of the essence, although the customer at the time had decided that they wanted to go down the external approach. However, the time going through the RFI and the RFP was a considerable amount of time. So just timing works in your favor if you're looking for an internal model, I suppose would be the point there. And also there's tighter control of the environment. So perhaps you're working in a regulatory environment where there is an element of that service integration has to be retained within the customer organization. So certainly I've worked in a number of Sarbanes-Oxley environments where it's really important you can demonstrate that there's ownership at that integration, that oversight element. Also, you may hear the word resource augmentation and think, what on earth does that mean? So that's about where individual roles within the service integrator are populated using people that are internal staff, and they're topped up by resources from a third-party organization. So you end up with a situation where even if somebody might not necessarily be directly employed by the customer, this still meets the qualification, the criteria of an internally sourced service integrator. So even though there are some external resources in there, the customer fundamentally has full control and overall ownership. So what situations are these typically used in? What kind of environments? So we spoke about capabilities. Perhaps in an external model, a customer may not have those capabilities, and they not only do not want to go out and recruit capability, they don't want to maintain them, so they would go with an external model. In the internal model, it's the exact opposite. So perhaps the customer already has an investment in in-house service integration and it has the capabilities. And not only that, it wants to grow those capabilities and it wants to maintain them, so that model suits the internal service integration approach. I've already mentioned about regulatory environments and tightly controlled governance and oversight and management elements. So if you are in an environment where you need very tight, very legislative or regulatory requirements when it comes to service providers, the internal model provides a greater level of that. And clearly, because the customer is also the service integrator, you've just by default you have greater control, you have greater flexibility over the SIAM ecosystem anyway, because if you think of the model of the customer at the top, then the service integrator as a separate entity, and then all your service providers, internal and external, you've got 3 layers. In the internal model, for all intents and purposes, you've got 2 layers, the customer having retained capabilities and service integration capability. And also timescales. So in a situation where an organization is up against a very tight timescale, or perhaps there's an element where an organization just doesn't allow procurement of external service integrators. It's just not allowed. You know, there are certainly organizations I can think of where the rules are just no. You can't go out and procure an external service integrator. That is not allowed. Like with a lot of things, there's pros and cons of doing one thing over the other. And if we look at internal pros and cons, clearly an advantage being the customer's got full control of the service integration role, so you're not relying on another company, an external service internal service integrator, you know, another third party, so any kind of risks or costs that may come in there. The advantages of having in-house is that you're retaining those skills. So perhaps you have key people that you want to retain, and those skills and that knowledge and that understanding, that's still there. That's not gone out to an external service integrator. You can argue the service integrator is going to be more flexible in terms of accommodating changes because it's part of the same organization. It's the customer. So any kind of contractual arrangements, there may not be costly revisions or costing or budget elements to that, or lengthy contractual negotiations. Clearly, because you are the customer and the service integrator, your service providers aren't going to feel as if they are competing against other organizations quite so much, because they're already have that relationship with the customer, so they're more likely to cooperate and collaborate and work together and play nicely. We've mentioned another advantage earlier about the speed here. So if speed is of the essence, the internal model will be able to be spun up and established usually much quicker than an external service integrator. And not only that, the customer already knows what the goals are and what the drivers are and the understanding, because they have that knowledge already internally. They're part of the same organization. So if we think about some of the disadvantages, though, of course, the disadvantage of this is that the customer has to develop, but not only develop, maintain the capabilities and the resources and the skills, and design and implement tool sets of a SIAM implementation. So by becoming the service integrator, there is a requirement around capabilities, resources and skills, not only developing those but maintaining those. Now, the customer may well say, we already have those anyway, so that's not a problem. But the next point here kind of leads quite nicely into that. The customer may underestimate the amount of time and effort and money perhaps it takes to actually spin up a service integration capability function. So while the disadvantage of you need to maintain capabilities and resources and skills, the argument to that could be, well, I've already got those. The second point here around underestimating that can be quite painful sometimes. Also, service integration is the same customer organization. So if you've got an argument between the same company, you're kind of in this situation where you need to be in a situation where you're not arguing with yourself effectively, because you can argue, well, you're the same organization. Well, yes, but we are the service integrator and you are the service provider. So there can be sort of a mediation type issue between the customer and the service provider if there's any kind of conflict. The other thing to just think about is there's a real risk of going back to the way things were done before we did SIAM. So it's about commitment, because it's an internal function that if it's not fully adopted, you won't get the benefits of it, and you'll just revert back to the old ways of working. So that there is a risk that the customer decides to act as a service integrator because they're just not really fully committed to the service integration and management in the first place. So that could be a real warning sign that they're not going to fully establish or outsource the infrastructure correctly, and it's just not fully adopted. Just as a parting thought, really, and I kind of touched on it on a few of my earlier points, depending on the model that's in place, but with an internal service integrator, you have to think about where are you going to place that from an organizational structure perspective. So for example, is it within IT, or actually is it a completely separate function? It's not part of IT, so perhaps that brings about a greater element of it's independent. It's a separate function. It's a separate department. And I've seen that work both ways. I think there's pros and cons of each, but certainly it's not unusual for service integration to be within the IT department, but I've also seen it externally. It's just really a parting thought, just to think about how would that work if you are running an internal, or you plan to adopt the internal approach. How's that going to work just from an organizational structure perspective? Okay, thank you for listening. Please do subscribe, and would appreciate if you liked the video. Thank you.